While I was growing up, my dad always made sure that my brother and I spent a lot of time outside. He wanted to make sure we had all the outdoor skills that he said would make us men. The thing is, I've always felt kind of paranoid in the woods. I always thought I needed to hide that from my dad, though. I didn't want to be a sissy and disappoint him. But I did get really good at scouting new trails and outfitting our campsites and all that stuff. It's not that I didn't like it, I just felt vulnerable out in the wild. Anyway, one year my dad got all excited about exploring the boundary waters in northern Minnesota. He then spent a couple weeks planning it out and finding the perfect campground, and within a few weeks we were off. A few days into the trip, it dawned on me that I was actually having a good time. My brother and I made friends with some other kids who were also there, and we found a great spot for cliff jumping at one of the lakes. The day after that, we headed out on a boat, and when the three of us were at a portage, we ran into some other campers who said they'd seen 2 moose swimming across the lake. We were excited to hear that, and were hoping for a chance to spot them. For some reason, I wasn't scared thinking of the moose, even though nowadays I realize how dangerous they can be. We had stopped paddling for the day, and were looking for a spot underneath a grove of trees to take a break. Once we found that, my brother then looked for a ledge where we could jump into the lake. While looking, we kept finding these huge stacks of rocks along the tree line. They weren't your typical little stacks that people usually make. They were made with super heavy rocks. Some of them were pretty precariously balanced, and my dad was yelling at us to keep away from them in case they fell over. He even tried to dismantle one that was close to the ledge that we wanted to jump off of. But the stones were too heavy for him to move. We finally found a good spot for jumping and spent an hour there before going back for dinner by the fire. For some reason, I was starting to get my old paranoid feelings back, even though we'd been having a great time. It didn't help that while we were eating, a weasel came running right through our campsite and into the water. At least we had a good laugh when we realized what it was. But the darker it got that day, the more I found myself wishing I could be at home. I eventually got settled into my sleeping bag, but I was having a hard time getting to sleep. I couldn't figure out why I'd gone from having fun to feeling like something was out to get me. I laid there until I heard my dad and brother start snoring, and then I felt really alone knowing that they were asleep. I wished I could just go to sleep without worrying, but I started freaking myself out just by listening to even the simple noises, like the leaves rustling. But that night the sounds were different. Even over the sound of my dad snoring, I kept hearing a soft thud over towards the lake. Our tent was probably about 200 feet from the water's edge, which didn't feel like a comfortable enough distance to me. I started wondering if those moose we'd heard about were nearby, but I didn't know if moose were nocturnal. Then I heard this incredibly loud splash. Since we had just heard about the moose that were swimming, I kept telling myself it must be them jumping into the water, but that didn't sound right either when I thought about it. I realized that it was unlikely that a moose would jump in. It would just walk in. All of a sudden, there was just this barrage of splashes. Dozens of splashes of things landing in the lake. Really heavy things. The lake sounded like it was just exploding when they hit. Definitely not moose. Then I started hearing this low howling that kept escalating into a loud whooping noise. I couldn't believe my dad and brother were sleeping through this. I decided I needed to risk a look out of the tent flap, so I unzipped it a tiny bit and slowly peered outside. When I looked out, I thought I was hallucinating. I could see a creature standing next to the water that looked in the moonlight like it was a giant hairy man. The howl was definitely coming from whatever that thing was. I was too scared to scream or even move, which is why I didn't wake up my dad or brother. Then I watched it take one of those incredibly heavy stones like the ones we had seen earlier and toss it into the lake like it was nothing. Then it lifted its mouth into the air and howled again. This time I snapped out of my incapacitated state and started shoving my dad to wake him up and whispering that something was wrong. I expected him to know what to do to scare that thing off. But instead, After he looked at it for a few minutes through the flap, he immediately zipped it back up and instructed me to stay completely still and quiet. His reaction freaked me out even more. I'd never seen my dad pause about anything, but he was visibly shaken. We listened for the better part of an hour while that thing raised hell out there. And then eventually we heard the sounds of it running off through the shallow water at the lake's edge. We stayed totally still for another 10 minutes, and then my dad barely unzipped the tent to look out. It was all quiet, and there was no sign of that thing. We heaved a huge sigh of relief when we realized we couldn't hear it anymore. My dad looked at me and said, "If I didn't know better, I'd think we just saw Bigfoot." Well, that was the end of any hope for sleep for me. I still couldn't believe my brother had missed the whole thing. We got up at sunrise, and while we loaded everything up, it occurred to me that the spot we had camped in might be its home, and the stacks of rocks might be some type of boundary markers. And if so, I have no idea why it didn't roust us out of the tent and do away with us, but I sure am happy it didn't. The last few days have been pure hell. Be careful while thrift shopping, and if you feel something off about the item you want to purchase, do not buy it. Trust your gut. I wish I had. I bought an antique vase from a thrift store a few towns over when my wife and I went on a small weekend trip. I had never been to that thrift store before. It was dark and cramped, but full of some neat stuff, some of which included vintage clothing, various pieces of furniture, and a beautiful antique clay vase with native carvings of buffalo and birds. I set the vase in the center of my dining table, but when I stepped back to admire my work, a sense of uneasiness came over me. I tried to put it past me and went to take my dog on a walk. I called her to me, and I noticed the way she avoided my dining table. She steered hard clear of it, something she didn't do before. I attached her leash onto her vest and, out of curiosity, pulled her towards the dining table. She locked her limbs and snarled, her eyes fixated on the vase. I laughed. The weirdest things freaked that dog out. At one point during our walk, I heard humming from my left side, almost like if somebody had put their face right next to my ear. I whirled around, but nobody was there. It didn't sound like a mosquito. The voice was too melodic. When I got home, loud, fast footsteps came from behind me and through my front door, traveling throughout my house like some invisible man was running about before it came to a sudden stop. I froze while my dog barked her head off. There was nobody behind me, and I didn't see anything that could have caused that noise. I slowly shut the door behind me and tried to calm my dog. I was feeling pretty spooked, so I phoned my wife to see when she would be home. While I was waiting for her, I hopped in the shower. I closed my eyes, shampooing my hair and humming along to my music to try and calm myself. Something about my music sounded weird, though. My heart dropped to my stomach when I realized it wasn't my music that sounded weird, but a second voice humming another tune. It was the same tune I briefly heard while walking my dog earlier. My eyes flew open and immediately were met by another pair of eyes peeking at me from the front of my shower curtain, but then instantly ducking away the moment I registered them. I screamed. My dog rushed into the bathroom and I held her, shampoo still in my hair, dripping water everywhere. When my wife finally arrived, I was a wreck. I had somehow managed to wash out the rest of the soap from my hair and put on some clothes. I sat with my back against the living room wall and my dog by my side. I wouldn't even let her leave the room. Every so often I swore I heard that cursed humming, but I wouldn't have put it past myself for imagining it. I was so on edge. My wife tried to comfort me, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. They convinced me to go to bed, and after experiencing all that adrenaline, I was pretty tired. That night I awoke coughing so hard I was seeing spots. I coughed up and gasped for breath, gagging and throwing up. At last I coughed up a wad of hair. My wife and I stared at it in my hand. It was long, silky, and black, covered in my saliva. Neither of us knew what to say. In the silence, I heard it humming. "There it is!" I screamed. "The humming!" My wife's face was pale. "Let's deal with this in the morning," my wife said through thin lips. I was livid. What did she mean in the morning? We had to deal with this now. But something wasn't right about my wife's expression. It looked like she was trying to tell me something. She held out her arms for a hug, and hesitantly I leaned in. She breathed quietly in my ear. "She's here." I froze. As my wife held me, I looked up and saw her face, horrible and sunken in, peering at us through the vent on our ceiling. I shut my eyes and buried them into my wife's chest. Something told me that if she saw us try to leave now, things wouldn't end well for us. That night, I shut my dog in my room and would not let her leave my side. We heard clanging and crashing downstairs all night, but we knew nothing would come of going to check. The dark circles under my wife's eyes told me she slept about the same as I did. We headed to the kitchen for breakfast in silence, not knowing what to expect. The kitchen was a mess. The cabinets were wide open and empty, its contents shattered on my floor. It was a mess. And all around us there was the sound of a woman humming, evil and otherworldly. I screamed, "What the hell do you want from us?" I grabbed the vase and threw it out the window. It flew right back and landed squarely on the table. I had enough. I had watched enough horror movies to know if I stayed here it would not end well. I grabbed my keys and told my wife to get up. I dropped my wife and dog at a friend's and am now headed to the thrift shop I bought the vase from. I don't think this thing is going to give up, but the least I can do is to get it away from everybody I care about. I've seen the damage it can do. I'm 1 hour into a 2-hour drive to the store, and I swear every so often I see a pair of eyes staring back at me from my rearview mirror. I wanted to share a story with you about a terrible encounter I had with a creature that has left me horrified and shaken. I hope that by sharing my story, others can find the same solace in knowing that they're not alone in their experiences. I was sound asleep in my small apartment. I had been struggling to make ends meet for a while, working long hours to pay my bills and living alone in a cramped space. But despite the hardships, I always felt safe in my home. That all changed that night. I'm just an ordinary guy, working a not-so-great job and living paycheck to paycheck. I never believed in the supernatural, paranormal, or anything like that. What I saw that night, though, changed everything for me forever. I was awoken in the middle of the night by a strange noise coming from outside my window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard scratching and tapping on the glass. I got up to investigate, but as soon as I approached the window, I became paralyzed. There, just outside my window, was a creature, unlike anything I had ever seen. It was pale-skinned, with long limbs and fingers that ended in sharp claws. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth was twisted in a gruesome snarl. It looked like a cross between a human and a wild animal, and it was staring right at me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just stood there, staring back at the creature. And then, without warning, it threw itself through the window, landed on the floor, and then lunged at me. I jumped back and fell to the floor and watched as it gave me a strange look, and then jumped back out the window. I was too stunned to call for help, too scared to move from my spot. I was alone and vulnerable, and I didn't know what to do next. The creature was gone, but the damage it had caused was undeniable. I was looking at my window that was shattered, and glass was everywhere. I was still in shock, trying to process what had just happened, when I heard my kitchen window explode open. It was the creature, returning for another attack. The thing was now inside my apartment, and there was no doubt that it was coming for me. It was a living nightmare, and I didn't know how to defend myself. I jumped up and slammed my bedroom door closed. It clawed furiously at the door. I could hear its awful, labored breathing. In a moment of desperation, I reached for my phone and dialed 911. I could barely speak. My voice was trembling, and I couldn't get the words out. Luckily, the dispatcher could hear the panic in my voice and sent help. Eventually, the clawing stopped, and I listened intently to try and hear its next move. But instead, I heard it scurry away. When the police arrived, they found me huddled in a corner, shaking and probably sobbing. I've never felt so vulnerable and small in my life. They searched the apartment, but there was no sign of the creature. They took my statement and tried to calm me down, but I could sense that they didn't believe me. They asked me if I had any enemies or people who would wish me harm, asked if I had any family I could stay with that night. I told them no to all of these since I was broke and barely did anything other than work and sit at home. They said it was probably a burglar, but I know the truth. It wasn't until I was able to do some of my own research that I figured out what I had seen that night. It was a creature called the Rake, a paranormal entity that preys on its victims and leaves them traumatized. It's said to be a creature that's been around for centuries, lurking in the shadows and waiting for its next victim. As I learned more about the Rake, I began to realize that my experience wasn't unique at all. Others had encountered the creature and were left with similar feelings of terror and helplessness. It was a horrifying realization, but it also helped me to understand that I wasn't alone. Since that night, I've done everything I can to protect myself from the Rake. I've installed extra locks on my windows and doors, and I always keep a weapon within reach. I know that it might not be enough to keep me safe, but it makes me feel better than doing nothing. I still have nightmares about that night, and I know that I'll never fully recover from the trauma of the experience. But I also know that I'm not going to let the Rake control my life. I will keep fighting, pushing forward, and sharing my story with others who might be going through the same thing. Looking back on that night, I feel that I'm lucky to be alive. The Rake is a creature that most people never encounter, and from what I understand, those who do rarely survive. But I'm also grateful for the experience in a strange way. It's made me more aware of the dangers that lurk in the shadows, and it's given me a new appreciation for life. As a lifelong farmer living in rural Texas, I'm no stranger to the occasional predator taking down a chicken or two. But something strange has been happening on my farm lately, and it's got me spooked. My livestock has been getting killed in the most gruesome way possible, with huge claw marks and signs of being devoured horrendously. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. This wasn't the work of wolves, bears, or anything like that. I've done lots of research, and I'm highly convinced it can only be the work of a chupacabra. I live on a remote farm in Texas, surrounded by miles of fields and woods. It's a peaceful life, and I love what I do. But lately, something has been killing my livestock, and I'm not sure the best way to tackle the problem. It's affecting my livelihood and my sanity, and I need to get to the bottom of it. I've been a farmer for over 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. I take pride in my work, and I care for my animals like they're my family. It's been tough to see them attacked and killed in such a violent manner. It all started a few weeks ago when I found one of my cows dead in the field. At first, I thought it was a mountain lion or a coyote, but the wounds were different. They were large and deep, and it looked like something had drained all the blood from the animal. I searched the area for any signs of what could have caused the wounds, and that's when I found the footprints. They were large, with long claws, and they didn't look like any animal print I'd ever seen before. I knew I had to find out what was causing this. Over the next few days, more of my animals were attacked and killed in the same way. I set up traps and cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was doing this. And then one night I saw it. I was sitting in my truck scrolling through social media on my phone when I saw a creature come from the woods. It was about the size of a large dog but had spikes on its back and long claws. It attacked one of my goats and took it down in seconds. I knew then that I was dealing with something far more dangerous than a coyote. I jumped out of the truck, grabbed my shotgun from the back, and ran after the animal. As soon as it saw me coming, it took off back into the woods. It was seriously fast, and I wasn't about to go trekking through the dark woods after it. Then the attacks became more frequent and more violent. Whatever this creature was, it seemed to be getting bolder and more aggressive. It wasn't just taking down my livestock anymore. It was coming closer to my home and my family. I started strategically parking my truck near my livestock and pretty much camping out in there to watch out for the predator and take care of it once and for all. One night I heard some stomping coming toward my livestock, and when I turned my truck's lights on, I saw the creature staring back at me. It was standing on two legs, and it had large yellow eyes and big awful teeth. I jumped out after it, and it escaped into the woods. I knew then that I had to do something before it was too late. I did some research, and that's when I first discovered that the creature I was dealing with could be a chupacabra, a legendary creature from Latin American folklore known for attacking and killing livestock. It was known for sucking the blood out of animals, and I'd never heard of any living creature doing that before. This had to be what I was dealing with. I reached out to some experts and authorities on the chupacabra, hoping to get some answers and advice. They told me that the creature was a nocturnal predator that was known for attacking and killing livestock, and that it had been spotted many times in Texas before. Finally, I felt validated and like I wasn't alone. They also said that the chupacabra was a mysterious and elusive creature, with many theories and legends surrounding it. Some people believe it's a government experiment gone wrong, while others think it's an alien or supernatural creature. Now I was positive that it was a chupacabra that had been attacking my animals, and I had to get serious about this and take action to protect my family and my livelihood as fast as possible. I set up traps and cameras and took extra precautions to keep my family and animals safe. And after weeks of waiting and watching, I finally caught the creature on camera. As I watched the footage, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief and closure. I finally had proof of what had been attacking my farm and knew what I was up against. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still so much I didn't know about the chupacabra and the mysteries of the world. I reported my findings to the experts and authorities, hoping to contribute to the understanding of this elusive creature. I also shared my story with others, hoping to raise awareness and caution for those who may encounter the chupacabra or other mysterious creatures. Looking back on the experience, I realize how little we know about the world and the creatures that inhabit it. The chupacabra may be just a legend to some, but it's also a reminder that there's still so much we have yet to discover and understand. Any tips on how to catch a chupacabra would be appreciated. While I'm glad to have found an explanation for the attacks on my farm, I also feel helpless that I still haven't been able to trap or kill the creature. The day I finally get my hands on the beast, I'm going to throw one heck of a party. I got to tell you about this story that happened to me. It's all true. All of the stories are true. I know because I've seen that creature that people talk about. I can hardly believe it. Since Alex passed away, I just up and sold my house. Couldn't stand to live there anymore, so I bought a used little camper trailer and traded my car in for a pickup to haul it. Been traveling around since, and I've seen a lot of stuff, but nothing like what I saw on the way to Memphis. I wanted to go to Graceland because Alex always wanted to go there, and we never did. Stuff always got in the way, money or whatever. I decided to camp at Myuu Shelby Forest State Park. The guy at the visitor center looked like Paul Bunyan or something. Big beard, hat, flannel shirt, the whole deal. Since it was November, the park was pretty empty. It wasn't that cold, but people might have been getting ready for Thanksgiving, I don't know. Paul Bunyan took forever, putting something in his computer, and then said, I just want to tell you that apparently there have been a lot of dogman sightings around. At least that's what people are calling it. Just so you know. I thought for sure he was messing with me, so I didn't say anything. I just wanted my campsite assignment. I was tired from driving all day. If you're scared of it, I can get you in a cabin. Probably safer, he says. I don't know anything about a dogman, I say. People say it's only in Michigan, but I don't believe that. They also say you only see it in years ending in 7, but I don't believe that neither. I was getting sick of it at this point, so I said, what do you believe? Me, I think dogmen's prowling around this area. Hungry, maybe, he said. How do you know? I asked. I heard it howl. Don't sound like no wolf or coyote. Sounds different, he says. I didn't know what that meant, but I decided not to ask. Then he goes, "You sure you want to be out there by yourself? No one camping today, just in cabins. I got a cabin you can have." I'd figured out my money pretty strict and I knew I didn't have enough for a cabin, so I said, "No, just let me have a campsite." He shrugs and goes, "Suit yourself." Circles my site on a paper map and gives it to me. I drove over to the site and put the blocks under the trailer. It's a teardrop, so I didn't have much other setting up to do. Since it was cold, I just heated up some soup in the microwave and sat at the table to eat. Didn't hear anything except the usual forest sounds. Bugs, birds, squirrels. I was tired, so I got into my little trailer bed early and fell asleep right away. Didn't hear anything all night. In the morning it was still cold, so I stayed inside for a little bit, making some pancakes from one of those shake and pour mixes. Drank some coffee and read my Memphis tour guide. I decided to hike around the park before leaving, but when I got out of the trailer, something told me to check on my truck. One of the tires, the one on the wood side, not the road side, was completely flat. I got down to look closer and I saw this ragged part, like something had been chewing on the tire. That was impossible, though. Nothing could have jaws powerful enough to chew a tire except a dinosaur, maybe. Something huge. But there it was. Whatever it was had teeth strong enough to puncture a tire. The hole wasn't that big, but like I said, the part around it looked chewed. I wasn't going anywhere until I got it fixed, but it was still pretty early, so I decided to go on the hike. Maybe I'd somehow figure out an answer. While I was walking, I saw a few tracks that could have been from a dog, but I couldn't be sure. They were too big, though, like as big as my shoe. No dogs that big. I decided to hike to the park office and see if Paul Bunyan was there. He was, so I told him I needed the name of a car repair shop. Told him something chewed a hole in my tire. He acted like that was totally normal and gave me a phone number. Weird dude. So I called the number and just told the guy I needed a tire fixed. He said he could send a tow. When I got off the phone, Paul Bunyan was staring at me. His actual name was Jeb, according to his name tag. "Dogman," he said. "Bit your tire." "No way," I said. He shrugged. Finally, they came and towed the truck. I rode along with them to the shop in the front seat. In total silence, mind you. But when the guy was done fixing it, he said, "What happened to that tire?" "Guy at the park thinks Dogman bit it," I said. "Put out some dog treats tonight. See if he eats them," the guy said. Apparently the whole town was nuts. "I don't have any," I told him. He gives me a box of dog treats from behind the counter and says, "Call and tell me what happens." I drove back to the campsite and left the dog treats a few feet from the camper. It was pretty late, so I went to bed. In the morning, I looked outside, and the treats were gone. Box and all. It was still a little dark, but I went outside. Checked the tires first. They were fine. When I stood up and looked around, I was sure I could see something staring at me from the edge of the woods. It was bigger than a man, maybe 8 or 9 feet. And sure enough, a face like a dog or wolf. Those tracks must have been from that thing because the feet were huge. It then snarled and bared its teeth at me, and those teeth made me think of a dinosaur's teeth for sure. Yeah, those teeth could have done that to the tire. I definitely did not want to make that thing mad, so I slowly packed up and hooked up my trailer and got out of there. Didn't stop at the visitor center, although I thought about that Paul Bunyan guy the whole way out of there. I guess those locals really do know what's up. I should have known better than to doubt them.